Perfect. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Philpott. I'm going to be the host, I guess, for this. I'm a retired professor at Memorial University. I just retired, actually, April 30th. So I'm in my first few months and loving it. And I'm also a research associate with the Atkinson Center for Society and Child Development at U of T. In 2017, I was on the Newfoundland Premier's Task Force on Improving Educational Outcomes, and I was the one responsible for the recommendation that Newfoundland follow suit, as some of the other provinces have been doing, and develop a data repository to track child development. This past summer, as follow-up to that, I did a little review or a little study on where the Atlantic provinces were in the progression towards data repositories with the support of the McCain Foundation. And one of the themes that came up really early in that study was that New Brunswick's repository is the envy of the nation, pretty much, and a lot of interest in what you're doing and how you're doing it, in particular, how you've handled the legislative changes to allow, to address the privacy concerns and allow the data to be collected and as well as accessed. And of course, the New Brunswick team was very gracious in offering to share their experiences with that, which brings us to today. And we thank them in advance for that. So we have two speakers. I'm quickly going to turn it over to them, who are going to walk us through their presentation. First, we have Dr. Ted McDonald, an economics prof at UNB and the founding director of the New Brunswick Institute for Research, Data and Training, and the current chair of the Canadian Research Data Center Network. I think I got that right, Ted. A more detailed outline of his credentials is included in the invitation for this event, but clearly we're very lucky to have him with us today. Joining Ted is Dr. Donna Curtis-Mayland, who is the privacy officer for the New Brunswick Institute since it started in 2015, which means she's exceptionally well-versed on the legislative changes, as well as all of the ongoing privacy concerns that they have dealt with. So we're thrilled to have her join us as well. And like Ted, Donna's bio is also outlined in greater detail on the invitation that we sent to you. So I'm about to turn it over to them, but before we start, a couple of very quick housekeeping items. The presentation we envision will go for about 50 to 60 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Ted and Donna forwarded a PDF of their presentation to us yesterday, and we sent it out to you to ease, jot notes and stuff like that. They've also allowed us to record this. So this webinar is being recorded and available to you and or your colleagues later today. When we start the Q&A, you can either use the chat feature to draw my attention or simply raise your hand and let me know that you have a question, and I'll develop a list. So let's all pray to the technology gods that this Zoom goes without a glitch. If not, Jane Bertrand is on standby to help me. Okay, so last thing, I'll ask everyone to mute their microphones during the presentation just to reduce noise interference. So Ted and Donna, I think the share screen feature is on, so you should be able to take over from me. Great. Off to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind introduction, and nice to see you again, and nice to see a few of you again. I see some familiar faces, others. I'm happy to chat more about this. As we go through the presentation, any follow-up after, we're happy to connect with you and give you more information or more discussion, or if you're interested in partnerships, we can do those too. So David mentioned about question and answer at the end. If there are questions as we go through this, we'd be happy to entertain them as they arise. So just put your hand up so we'll know, and we'll follow up there. But there should be plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So this will be a joint presentation. I'm going to introduce the Institute, give you a quick overview. Donna, could you go to the next slide? Oh. And so I'll do the introduction, and I'll talk about the legislative pathway to establishing NB-IRDT. So it's New Brunswick Institute for Research, Data and Training, and in particular focus on the process of amending legislation and give you some sense of how we got to this point. So we were only officially launched as an institute in 2015. We got our first data set in 2015. Now we have more than 60 data sets. So I'm going to take you through some of those details. And then I'll hand it over to Donna, and she's going to talk about getting into some of the details about how we protect privacy and confidentiality of the citizens on whose data we have, and also privacy by design, the principles on the foundation for where the Institute is established. And this is a really important part of it, not just if you're a privacy officer, who the privacy officers find this exciting, but the rest of us should appreciate that it's very important, because none of this is possible without the province putting a lot of trust in us that we are going to be careful custodians of the data in which we are entrusted. And that is based on good policy and good practice. And then I'll come back to me. I'll talk a bit about our relationship with government in New Brunswick. It's been a partnership from the beginning, and give you some examples of some of our government and research. I'll talk about the governance model and then talk about some of our research agreements. And in particular, I'm going to highlight a few that are specifically relevant to education. And then the last couple of slides, we'll talk about how we managed to get here so far, so enablers of success. So next slide, please. So this is just a very quick 3-minute overview of what the Institute does. So I thought it would be easiest just to say what we do, and the next slide is what we don't do. So what we are at the core of the Institute is we are a provincial research data center and data custodian as defined in New Brunswick legislation. And so this complies specifically with New Brunswick legislation. We are not authorized to hold data from other provinces. We do hold some data from a federal agency, which I'll get into later, but that's under a specific agreement. But most of what I'm going to be talking about, it relates to specifically within the province of New Brunswick. And so what that status as a research data center and data custodian entitles us to do is to receive copies and provide access in a secure environment to what we call person-level, de-identified, but linkable program data. So there's a term that's sometimes used, pseudonymized. It's a little bit cumbersome, but basically what it means are the data from a legal perspective are still identifiable. So they're stripped of direct identifiers, no name, no address. If there's a Medicare number or OHIP number in Ontario, the equivalent in Ontario, which is what ICPS does, those have been removed and scrambled and replaced by unique random numbers. So that's important from the research perspective because it allows our data sets to be linkable. So, at the individual level, so to be able to say, let's look at a person's trajectory from school to post-secondary education, into whether they're receiving social assistance, interactions with the justice system, interactions with the health system, and so on. But it's de-identified so that our researchers, we don't actually see any names or addresses. So, and that's not relevant from a research point of view, because we're doing community level or population level data, even though the data underpinning that are individual level data. So what do we do with that? Well, we run an extensive program of research and program evaluation. And by and large, it's to support GMB planning and policy development, although we do a lot of other work as well, which I can give you some sense of later on. And one of the features that we have, and this is designed in our originating principles, is the capacity to take what we call user-provided data. So you can think of so in the health field, a clinical trial, or observational studies, or information that's gathered by, say, health technology, or in other contexts, any information that might be gathered by a researcher, let's say looking at an intervention in school to improve attendance or whatever that is, that those files, as long as there's the appropriate consent for linkage, can be linked to all of our data so that you can do specific program evaluation. And some of you are familiar with the Maritime Spore Support Unit. I won't get into the detail of what the acronyms mean, but it is, we do anchor the Maritime Spore Support Unit, of which Halifax, or Nova Scotia and PEI are co-partners. Next slide, please. So what we don't do, and it's really important to emphasize this, because at its foundation, what we had to do is sort of thread the needle between working with government in a way that did not challenge their authority or their budgets or their, the area that they're responsible for, nor to create a lot of work for them. So it's kind of like a tightrope to get through that. And so what we don't do, we don't get real-time data. So we're not integrated into health information systems. We get updates every year. And so the data analysis is by its nature retrospective. We do not provide guidance or treatment of practice on specific individuals. There's no way we can identify an individual, and so it's not in our mandate anyway. And the third thing, and this is important, this was important in developing our relationship with the province, with the Department of Health, is we do not replace the regular reporting functions required by health authorities or agencies. So our turf is clearly research, program evaluation. We don't overlap with the regular functions of government and reporting and monitoring. Before I get on to the next slide, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't define administrative data. So I'm going to be talking a lot about administrative data. Administrative data are the information that's collected when an individual interacts with a government service. So when you file tax, when you go to school, when you see your doctor, when you get your car registered, all of those things, if you appear in court, all of those things generate information. It's information on you, it's information on the service. And there's a huge amount of information that's being collected in the system. And those of you on the line who are part of the education system in your province, you know you're collecting a huge amount of information on the students, on how they're doing, their attendance, are there health issues, are there standardized test scores. There's a huge amount of information in those records. And up until the last probably 10 to 15 years, it just has not really been used in any systematic way for research. It's hugely important for evaluating what works and what doesn't. And as our government partners become more attuned to the need for evidence-based or evidence-informed policymaking, the demand is increasing. So there are some exceptions, of course, and if any of you are familiar in Ontario with the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Science, ICES, they've been operating for about 20-some years, Manitoba Centre for Health Policy similarly. So almost every province has something like a provincial data center. In Newfoundland, it's NILCHI, Newfoundland Labrador, NLC, Centre for Health Information, NILCHI, I know the acronym. But what sets us apart, and I'll get into the details in just a minute, is that from its inception, NB-IRDT was set up to be a repository for all the province's data. So those provincial data centers either are specifically or exclusively health information, or if they have other information, it's sort of what's evolved over time. I think Manitoba has some education data. I think Ontario may have some education data, or they're working on it. But our approach has kind of allowed us to kind of leapfrog the pack in terms of the progress we've been able to make in a relatively short time. So next slide, please. So the staff and budget, we have, well, if you count up those individuals, we have it lists about 20-some, but we're actually over 30 people now. We have a mix of senior research associates, database analysts, research assistants, postdoctoral fellows, operations staff, so they don't actually undertake the research, but they make everything go, whether it's finance or Donna's data and privacy unit. We have seconded employees from the government of Brunswick, GNB, and we're overseeing the Healthy Senior Pilot Project. Some of you may be aware of that. It's a major initiative in New Brunswick aimed at improving health for seniors. And in 2019, we have about $2.7 million in grant and contract revenue, and in 2020, it's more than $3 million. So we've expanded very quickly over the past number of years. And that's a picture there. This is pre-COVID, what some of us used to look like a few years ago. Next slide. So I'm going to get into the details about how we managed to get there. I'm kind of the punchline, which is all the data sets we have, I'll actually save till later. But I want to set the stage here with how we got here. And so in 2010, and if some of you have heard me talk about the Institute before, you know this backstory. So 2010, the Deputy Minister of Health at the time, Don Ferguson in New Brunswick, said, I heard about this Manitoba Center, let's go check it out. He came back and said, let's do that, and then he retired. And so I kind of inherited this, let's do that, which was a really easy thing to say. And 10 years later, it's been my life's work for the last 10 years. But it sort of, in its conception, it was initially about health, but early on, we started working with the Executive Council Office. So this is the kind of the peak oversight part of government, equivalent to the Privy Council at the federal level. And they were kind of sold on the idea of, well, let's try and expand this beyond health, because we know that we're going to need evidence to inform our decision-making across the spectrum of provincial government operations. We know that we're spending a huge amount of money, and we have actually a surprisingly little way to evaluate formally what's working. So there's been lots of evaluation on process. How is the program rolling out? Is it efficient? But there's much less capacity to be able to say, well, is it actually changing outcomes is in the short, the medium, and the longer term? So that was the kind of the throwdown. Let's do this. And so we're really creating something from zero. And prior to just shortly before this, New Brunswick updated its privacy legislation to launch FIPA, Personal Health Information Privacy and Access Act. And so the first thing we had to do, and none of this would happen without the buy-in from the province at the senior levels from the beginning. You don't get to change legislation unless you've got that commitment at the senior levels. So in 2012 was the first change in legislation. FIPA was changed to define a research data center and designate it as a data custodian. This was an important step. Well, first of all, because it allowed us to then exist as a research data center. But as a data custodian meant that the province could entrust us with holding copies of the data, not for specific research questions. So at the end of a research question, we don't destroy the data. We are entrusted to hold these data under a series of regularly renewed agreements, and that we take on the role of providing access to researchers. So we become the gateway, we become the process through which projects are approved and individuals get access, and Donna will cover a fair bit of that in her section. So the first change was in 2012 to designate us as a data custodian. 2015, and FIPA was again changed in the legislature to allow Medicare and health insurance number to be used for data matching to conduct research. So it was always intended that Medicare would be, that's our provincial health insurance number, would be used as our population backbone. So almost everyone in the province has a Medicare number. And so, although, and no province, I don't think, has any kind of universal ID, this was going to be something that we would base our population on. So allow us to do population level analysis. And it doesn't mean that data sets that don't have Medicare number are then required to collect it. And in fact, the collection and use of Medicare number is tightly regulated. But what it did mean is that through whatever means we could, and through the Department of Health, that the data could be linked, and the Medicare number and its scrambled version, which is the Institute ID, is what we use to be able to link data across time for individuals and across programs. And what we had found then, though, is that that there was a fair bit of sort of loose interpretation of appropriate uses for Medicare number was sort of loosely being applied. And it came to light shortly before we wanted to use Medicare number for linking purposes, that the system was using Medicare numbers to award loose licenses. And if you look at the FIPA legislation, it doesn't say anything about awarding loose licenses. So there was a really strict clampdown in saying, no, the Medicare number is really important. It can only be used for specific specified purposes in the legislation. And a research data center and data linkage was not one of them. So FIPA was changed to allow that to be done. And that was a fundamental change in FIPA legislation for us. Then in 2015, we were launched as an institute. The premier of the time was there on site. And then also in 2015, we received our first data set, the discharge abstracts, that's the hospital records. And in 2016, we spent much of that time, because we basically had an institute, but we had no policies and procedures, we had to invent everything. And so we defined and drafted originating agreements, operating agreements, foundational privacy impact assessments, and threat and risk assessments, and data sharing agreement templates. And again, at that level, there was the idea from the province was, well, let's try and make this standardized and replicable. So that let's use templates, let's use standard approaches to reduce and ease the burden on departments who are potentially interested in disclosing data for research purposes. Next slide. But then we hit a wall, and this is 2016. So with lots of work already in place to get this up and running, we hit a wall. And the issue was that although FIPA allowed us to be a data custodian and receive data, there was a lack of, there was a legal opinion that said that unless there's a clear legislative authority for other data to transfer to us, that nothing could be transferred to us. So we were able to keep the hospital records, but that was because the only legislation that covered the hospital records was FIPA. But if you look at, say, the Medicare Act, which would cover physician billing, although FIPA allowed for transfer, the Medicare Act said nothing about transfer to a research data center. Our TIPA, excuse me for just a second. RTIPA covers everything that's not health information. It also said nothing about disclosing to a research data center. So all personal information, including even Medicare provider information, but also anything on education, income support, justice, training, immigration, housing, was covered by RTIPA, and RTIPA didn't say anything about about a research disclosing to a research data center. And then even things which are clearly in the health domain, such as long-term care and nursing home care, were covered under additional pieces of legislation. So there were multiple pieces of legislation that applied to a specific data set, and unless each of those provided a legal authority for us to receive the data, the opinion was that the data could not be transferred. And so everything stopped. So we had one data set, we were just getting started, and that's where everything stopped. And I should also point out that it was and I think this is the case for most provincial government departments, there were also very strong restrictions on the departments sharing data between them. So even though in New Brunswick, say, long-term care and nursing homes are the domain of social development, it's clearly related directly to the Department of Health's mandate, but they can't share data with each other, except for very specific purposes. And broader program evaluation and research is not one of them. And so they couldn't link their data either. And this is really important because it actually set us up for the main reason that government was so supportive of what we wanted to do, was that it was much easier for them to be able to find a way to share with us than to share with each other. It's kind of ironic, but that's the way it is. So that's the challenge. It was a crisis. It caused me a lot of stress, and here was the solution. So next slide, please. The solution. So I don't know if any of you are film buffs. The solution was the act respecting research. Does anyone know my film reference there? So that's Daniel Day-Lewis in Gangs of New York. And that's him saying, well, if it was a GIF, that's him saying challenge accepted. So the way that we accepted the challenge, it was called an act respecting research. And when I say we, I really mean the province. We worked very closely with them, but this was their idea. And so if they looked at the alternatives, one was to say, well, let's just go through the list and we're going to go into the legislature for 40 different pieces of legislation. It is just not practical, because this is actually legislation that is, it's a draft bill, it's read, it gets first, second, third reading, needs royal assent, there's debate, the opposition has to be on side. It's a complicated process. And so rather than do that, the Executive Council Office, and I'm going to highlight this later, the important role that the Executive Council Office played was to say, let's adopt a different approach where we're going to come up with an omnibus bill. We're going to define a piece of legislation that overlays and adds a clause about disclosing to research data center for evaluation and research, overlays over a bunch of existing legislation. So we're going to pass one bill, and it's going to cover all of those things. The second important part of it was it also provided the department's authority and public bodies to share information with the Department of Health for data matching purposes only. So any broader intent to share data would have been too politically difficult between the government departments, but they all agreed that this was reasonable, that they could share only enough information with the Department of Health to allow what's called a crosswalk file to be generated for files to be linked. And so Bill 57 was proclaimed into law in May 2017, and it modified 10, every time I present this, I use a different number. I'm not exactly sure of the number, so I played it safe and said 10 plus pieces of legislation, including RTIPA and the Medicare Act. So this was, as far as I know, unique in the country about this kind of omnibus approach to specifically geared to defining authority for a research data center, which is outside of government, to be able to operate. And it was also felt that this would not be possible within government, nor did they want the headache of having to deal with academic researchers all the time. And so that was done. It was done amazingly fast, in this grand scale of legislation. But in their haste, they actually missed a few pieces. And these came to light when we started working with the Department of Social Development to get income support data. So this would be information on any individual who receives means-tested support from the Department of Social Development. So the government was actually changing government. The Bill 57 was under a Liberal government. Bill 29 was under a Conservative government. They went back to the legislature and tabled Bill 29 with the same name, an act respecting research, and it addressed those gaps. And I'll highlight in particular and address the MPHEC Act, Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commission Act for post-secondary information. And I was listening to it online with the reading, and one of the members of opposition who rose after the bill was presented, in her comments, she said, "I think this is an excellent idea. I support this fully because I drafted the first one." So it helped that we had different governments, different political governments of different political stripes, each introducing a piece of legislation. So that's where we are now. Go to next slide, please. And so how do we make this happen? And we, I mean the New Brunswick Royal We. So the Executive Council Office and the Deputy Clerk led the process. So there's a very senior bureaucrat who carried a big stick. She believed in this from the beginning. She's been the champion from the beginning. She's been fantastic. I'm just so relieved that she didn't retire over the last 10 years. But that started in late 2016. You have to get political buy-in. This was green-lighted by the Premier as a priority. So I've come to understand that when proposals come up, they get green-lighted, yellow-lighted, or red-lighted. Red-lighted means forget it. Yellow-lighted means, yeah, maybe, but we're not going to put any rush on it. And green-lighted means get it done. A coordination was assigned. Coordination for this big task was assigned by a senior policy advisor. And so when we're talking about 10 to 15 pieces of legislation, every one of those departments would need a legal authority. They would need an evaluation. They would need support from the deputy for this to go through. And I should also add that none of this actually compelled any data to be transferred. There was no compelling, it just provided the legal authority. So if a government then department subsequently wanted to enter into a data sharing agreement with us, that they could do so. So this removed one of the main impediments. We worked very early with deputy ministers and with the Office of the Attorney General. And we had follow-up, and this was something that I was really pleased to hear, and I thought it was a great idea. And it worked very well, is that rather than, and this was from the departments were told or suggested, it was suggested to the departments that when they met with the Office of the Attorney General, not to say, can we do this, but to say, help us draft text that will allow us to do this. So work with us to find language that would satisfy you that this defines the authority for us to do this. And we had about 3 or 4 months of consultations with the opposition, the privacy commissioner, many stakeholder groups. So this really was a joint effort between IRDT staff and the government to get this done. Next slide. So the implication is it's the main obstacle at that time to the transfer of data, which was a lack of legislative authority, was resolved. And so the actual transfer of administrative data was narrowed to operational issues, drafting agreements and identifying and mobilizing available resources. It's only 2 quick short points. There is a huge amount of work involved in each of those. And I really don't mean to suggest that that's trivial. Those are really big hurdles, and there's all kinds of work underway across the country to try and reduce those hurdles. But the main one, which is if you don't solve this, nothing's going to happen with the legislative authority. Next slide. So what came of that? Well, this slide indicates where we went from there. So the idea of having general or master data sharing agreements was also a really good one that came from the Department of Health. And the idea was that for us to receive any data set, we need some sort of legal paper. We need some sort of, we need a legal authority. We also need some sort of legal agreement that says we have custody of this data set and here's what we're going to do with it and for how long. So that would mean, say with the Department of Health, they probably have 500 different data sets that to go through that process time and time again was going to be almost impossible because as every department in the province and every provincial department in the country knows that you have finite resources, limited amount of time, demanding ministers, you just don't have time and the resources to be able to do this. So the approach was, let's define a master data sharing agreement. And what that does is say, whatever the data set is that's transferred to NB-IRDT, it will be protected and accessed exactly the same way. So a standard set of conditions that we will treat every data set the same. So with that signed, and again, it didn't compel the transfer of any data, that subsequent data files, particular data files, could be just a schedule, an attachment, and we didn't need legal opinion. There's still a privacy impact assessment, but that's standardized. And we really took advantage of the fact that we have this standard approach to holding, to protecting, to accessing data, and we apply it universally. And so with the first one signed by the Department of Health, what followed quickly after were data sharing agreements with both of our regional health authorities, Horizon and Vitalité. We signed one with the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. We signed one with Post-Secondary Education, Training, and Labor. We signed one with the Department of Social Development. And we actually, the most recent one, we signed one with WorkSafe New Brunswick. So this would be occupational health and safety. We're in discussion and advanced development with MPHEC to receive post-secondary data from on New Brunswick students, and also Departments of Justice and the Department of Public Safety. And we've already signed a data sharing agreement with Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada for all the landing records, temporary foreign worker files, permanent worker file, permanent resident files of people across the country. And all of these things are able to be linked across departments. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I'm just going to present them kind of as lists to say, here's what we've got. So what has followed from the legislative authority to collect and receive data, to the master data sharing agreements, and to the actual implementation of those. And again, these are data sets that we hold as custodians. So they're not tied to any specific project. We are entrusted with the job of controlling access. We control who gets in, we control what they see, we control what they take out. And because the government was part and parcel of the development of all of those policies, they were co-developed, that they know exactly what we're going to do, and they've been evaluated externally through privacy impact assessments. So we've earned the trust to be able to do this. And so you can see the citizen database is basically our Medicare registry. It's a prepared version of a Medicare registry, hospital records, physician billing, drug plan, chronic disease, toddler assessment, and a bunch of other ones. So that's just from the Department of Health. Next, please. From the regional health authorities, a whole bunch of clinical data from the electronic health record, and more data pending. So whether it's radiation therapy or IV oncology or ER encounters, it's all either transferred or it's in the process of being transferred. And again, the limit is really just resources, is just time and resources. Next slide. Here's the list of what's probably of more relevance to people in the education sector, is that we now have, and the New Brunswick uses the Power Schools system for report cards and student tracking of progress, the K-12 student grades and attendance for the entire province, both Francophone and Anglophone districts. We have the provincial assessment scores. And these vary in the number of years they go back. Some may go back 3 or 4 years, some may go back 10 years. It varies by the source of data. We have early years evaluation. We have adult education and training program participation. I mentioned the immigrant landing records. We have long-term care, suicide registry, university and community college enrollment data. So this is information on what you were enrolled in, when you graduated, and a bunch of other sort of information that the system, that the university system or the college system collects. WorkSafe New Brunswick claims data, we have that pending, apprenticeships, social support program participation. This one is really important. There's been a few delays in getting it, but basically this is our way to look at socioeconomic status at the person level. Is your family, or anyone in your family, receiving some sort of means tested in program support from social development? We may not be able to see where you are in the income distribution, but we will see that you are low income because you've been receiving this program support. Nursing home data, motor vehicle accidents, court appearances, and some industrial data as well. Next slide. Okay, that's it for me. Maybe this, with Donna's permission, maybe we could stop there and see if there are any questions before we get into the establishing the reassurance.
If there's any questions, you can feel free to just ask them. I don't think there's going to be a lot here.
Okay, over to you, Donna. I'm going to put myself on mute now until.
All right, thank you, Ted. So essentially, what I wanted to do is just take the opportunity to share with you how we've gone about establishing reassurance or building that reassurance with our data partners, with our government partners, and how we've approached really practicing privacy to make sure that we've got a solid data privacy and security program. But the first thing I need to do is I'm just going to do a little privacy 101 with you here, and that is to make sure that we understand the data life cycle, because this is sort of the base or the foundation for a lot of the work around privacy. And that's to recognize that regardless of the type of information that we're talking about with respect to personal information or personal health information, or whether it's de-identified, fully identifiable, it doesn't matter. When you are about to collect it, whether you're collecting it, say, as a primary healthcare provider, or you're in an education situation and you're collecting information on students, how you access it, going into that part of the life cycle, whether you're accessing it, maybe you're doing, looking at student report cards for evaluation work, or you're accessing it to provide healthcare services, how you go about using it. So if you're going to be using it for research purposes like we are, and how you share it, how you disseminate it, how it goes on, circle of care, those kind of situations. And finally, how do you dispose of it? And that is the final piece. And if you're of a certain age like myself, way back, we used to just collect information and collect it, and because you never knew, you might need it someday. And that is gone. So now we have to be really conscious of the life cycle, from the collection all the way through to how we securely dispose of it. And this idea of a life cycle is really, really important, because we always come back and visit it in privacy work to say, you know, are we collecting, and what are we doing in this particular situation? And so how do we follow this life cycle is we work within the law. And this is where we're so fortunate in New Brunswick that we have the support that we've had to develop the Research Institute. And what I wanted to just speak to here is that the legislation, and as a privacy person, I will tell you there could be a lot more oomph to it, but it has provided us the guidance that we need to move forward. Specifically, it's given us requirements to operate as a research institute. And this is what we need. And it speaks to, in the legislation, important safeguards. Many are prescriptive, and they are administrative safeguards. And it will say things like, you will have an agreement with the, you know, with the department or with whoever is sharing the data. But many are also more descriptive, and they speak about the physical safeguards or the technical safeguards, and how you're going to make sure you're doing best practices and whatnot along that sort of those lines. And so that provides us with policy that we follow. And we actually have a set of 11 data privacy and security policies that are part of our institute that were very carefully reviewed by the government and even the privacy commissioner at the time. And this gives us sort of the overall sort of framework that we're working with. And then from there, we have the privacy principles. And I wanted to point these out to you because the privacy principles are a set of internationally accepted principles that must be followed around the world if you are practicing privacy. And sometimes they're called fair information practices, and you may be familiar with them in different settings. You may have already sat through a privacy training session with someone like myself, and they've gone through it. And so where we know that everything has to be built on the data life cycle, these principles actually feed into legislation development. They feed into how are the philosophies around privacy. And just to go through them very, very quickly is to say, you know, we're talking here about being accountable, that everyone is accountable for their actions when it comes to personal information. Identifying purpose. What we're saying there is that you always have to have a purpose before you access any kind of personal information. And you have to provide that rationale. So even as a research institute, if we have a large data set and someone is seeking to access a particular variable of that data set, we have to see a rationale. So we make them go through that process. This is not easy for researchers because we're used to, we want everything, right? We want to be informed. So they'll look at a data set, and every particular variable for that data set that they want to use, they have to state the reason why. We limit collection. We only give what is necessary to actually access the data. So by that, I always joke and say we don't throw any added value. We don't add any extra data sets just because. It's very limited. It's what do you need to do the work that you need to do. We limit use, disclosure, and retention. Essentially, we stay within the approval we've been given. What kind of approvals do we get? Were we given approval to access data to do research, or were we given approval to prepare a dissertation or something like that? So we stay within that. The principles speak to those safeguards that are found in legislation, administrative, technical, and physical. The principles speak to the idea of consent. This is extremely important. The privacy principle of consent speaks to that everyone has that right to determine for themselves when and how information about them is being used. And if consent is, if we're not in a situation where consent cannot be granted, so we're looking at what we're doing with large data sets, it's impractical. There are a set of mechanisms that must be followed in the legislation that say, okay, if you're going to circumvent consent, you will do this. So there's no skipping over these principles. There's also the principle of accuracy. This is speaking so important in the research work that we do, that the data we are accessing is accurate and true. If we are going to inform public policy by our research work, or to, say someone can or cannot access a particular service or participate in a particular social program, the information we hold on them had better be accurate and true. Openness, we cannot be secretive about what we're doing with people's personal information. So by that, I just mean we have to be open. We are a research data center. We provide access in a secure environment. This is what we do. We do research work, and we provide that information through our website by speaking about what we do, by the research work, by sharing, by disseminating our research findings. And so that's really important. And then finally, the last two principles just speak to the idea that individuals always have that right to know what information is being held on them, or to challenge compliance if there's a concern that somehow their information is not being protected appropriately. And so just by those 2 points, those are just coming back to that idea that democracy around rights and privacy rights. So, and even as a research institute, and we don't hold unique identifiers, so we still have to have a mechanism in place. If someone was concerned about what was going on in NB-IRDT, we would send them back to the original data business owner. So we have direction that we always, so there's no skipping over these principles. But the main point to say there is just that having those principles is sort of that we have our legislation, and then we have our principles as the next layer. And then building on those principles is we have the concept of privacy by design, and that's how we plan. That's where we come around. This is ensuring that we are going to be legislatively compliant with the obligations that we have, and we build privacy practices right into our workflows. We make them a requirement of the workflows. And what's so amazing about this piece in the privacy sort of, if you will, in our toolbox, is that this came out of the work of Anne Cavoukian. She was a former privacy commissioner in Ontario. And this privacy by design concept is so fundamental now to the privacy world that it is actually embedded in legislation internationally. So the European Union, the privacy by design is addressed specifically in the regulation that protects the privacy of the information for all European citizens. So it's an amazing tool that we have. And it speaks to that whole idea. It's very common sense risk management, but very proactive. So we're proactive and not reactive to situations. We're preventative, not remedial. It's privacy by our default setting. We always just go right to how do we protect privacy, embedding it into our design of our processes. But one of the key pieces is that it's full functionality. And often what happens, particularly when we're talking around policy, is that we'll have a situation where security becomes all and we forget about privacy, or we go the other way and we do everything around privacy and we don't address security. So we have to find that balance in between. It's an end-to-end security. So this is another thing, this is talking exactly to the life cycle, that we are always addressing that. Visibility and transparency have to be part of our planning. How are we being visible and transparent about what we're doing with personal information? And always coming back to that respect for the user, that right in the concept of rights around privacy. So that gives us our planning piece. And the sort of the final piece are the procedures. So we would have our policies, we have our principles that we're following, and we have our plan of action. So now we have our procedures. And this comes back to a framework that's called the 5 safes. And we're constantly revisiting this in all of our workflows. So are the people safe? Are the projects safe? Safe settings, safe data, and safe outputs. And so if you put all of these together, sort of like an equation, this is what gives you a solid privacy program, and that's going to make sure that you remain compliant all the time. And it also means that you're going to be able to be fluid if there's changes in legislation, because it means that everything is tied together. So if there's really big changes, let's say, in legislation, we can easily change those through our principles and through our design. And what I wanted to just take a chance to talk to you about are some of the 5 safes that we actually have in place at NB-IRDT. And so the first one is our process for actually accessing data. We have, so around safe projects, that would be sort of going back to the framework. And so we have this layered approach. So we start with the applicant, or the potential applicant, must submit a feasibility. And so this is just that initial layer to say, they want to access certain data sets. Is it appropriate? Is what they want to do with the data appropriate? And Ted reviews that as the director of the institute, make sure everything's aligned. And then if everything's fine, then the individual is actually, and it does save headaches, right? So then the individual is invited to actually put in for a data access application. And once that data access application is completed, and that would include your whole, the goals of your projects, your methodology, the details, who you want to work on the data, your users, who you would like to see doing the research work. Then we go through an application review process. And this review process is very rigorous. People tend to get a little bit, sometimes they're like, really? But it really does make sure that we stay compliant. And it's also a very cooperative review process. And that's what I like about it. So the very first layer is institute review. So we meet around a table with the researcher, and we have sort of peer-to-peer review. We have a data analyst that looks at the methodology. We have myself just looking at sort of the basics around privacy compliance. We have our research manager. She's speaking to, do you have the resources to do the work? Sort of those practical pieces. And then once any issues are brought up, we have our senior data analyst as well, I should say that, because he'll identify maybe some variables that are just completely way off mark, or variables that are being requested that have not been, that should be included, or need complementary ones. So it's a great discussion. And then from there, sometimes there's modifications to the application. Then we go on to what we call the data research committee meeting. And this is I think, an amazing opportunity. We provide the opportunity for the data business owners, the original data business owners, to gather around the table, this time with the researcher, and speak to the use of their data sets. So if we had someone who wanted to use early education and childhood development data sets, then our representative from the Department of Early Education and Childhood Development would be around that table. And that's what's so interesting. They have a chance to hear how it's not a veto process. It's not a chance to say, oh, I don't like this work. It's a chance to say, oh, have you considered these variables? Because the departments know the data. And that's where I think this cooperative piece is so important. There's a privacy and security training component. I'm going to address that just in a second. There is an REB. That has to be done under the legislation. Like I said, there's administrative safeguards. It says that any secondary use, so a secondary use of administrative data would be research work, requires an REB review. So we have that process built in. We're very fortunate that UMB-REB is willing to do that for us. And then we have a privacy review, just in that we go through the actual legislation step by step and make sure we haven't been missing anything. And then the final piece is that if everything looks good, then we put the package together, the documentation, the data access application, and send it off with a letter of recommendation from Ted as the director to the Office of Research Services. And it's at that point that it gets approved. And so then the potential research lead would enter into a data access agreement with the university. And so that's how we make sure that the projects remain safe. It's thorough, it's robust, and there's a lot of opportunity to just sort of catch gaps, and it's been working very well, I think. So then we have safe people. So very quickly through that part, it's anybody who wants to access data or even work at the Institute has to go through these requirements. So there, you must go through privacy training. That's with yours truly. We have a criminal record check. We will take anything in the last 12 months kind of thing. We have approved user forms. This is actually a liability piece, because one of the amazing things about our Institute as part of the process is you do not have to be a member of the UMB community to be able to access data, but you do have to have all the approvals so in place. So you could come from elsewhere and use the resources at NB-IRDT. So there's a liability issue around there. So we have the approved user form, we have confidentiality agreements. Everyone signs the confidentiality agreement. Everyone signs it. So because even if you know, there's no intention that you're going to be somehow maybe releasing information or being even physically in the lab, it's still a requirement if you're associated with NB-IRDT. And then finally, there's a security and vetting training session. And what's going on there is just the security around the actual secure facility and the vetting rules, a sort of a basic overview of what data can actually leave the facility. And so this is where we get that approved user status, and we can address safe people. Then we also have safe settings. You do not get into the facility until you've gone through the first 2 steps, and then now you've got the data actual access. So we have 2-factor authentication to get in. We have unique passwords and names for every project folder. Our workstations are disabled. We have many, many physical and technical safeguards in place that provide that added reassurance to our data partners. And one of the things Ted mentioned earlier, that we had a privacy impact assessment and the threat and risk assessment completed prior to starting, but we also have a requirement to have a threat and risk assessment done every 3 years and a privacy impact assessment done every 5 years on all of our activities. So all of these processes, because technology changes so fast, what might seem secure and safe today, 2 years from now might not be. So those kind of best practices are embedded as well. We have safe data, and what I mean by this is the verifying and the mitigating and mitigating disclosure risks in the data. We are really working around that. So the data that gets accessed has to be approved. So, and what that means is essentially a unique project data set is prepared based on the approvals. All those variables that were given rationale and were agreed to back in the data access application process, those are the ones that are included in the project folder. And if it can be something, if it can be a situation where 2 variables can come together and serve as one. So by sometimes people would like to have, all they need to know is if someone's in a particular age group. They don't really need to know their full date of birth. They just need to know they're between 1 and 5, 6 and 10, 11, those kind of things. If that's the case, that's the way the data is provided to them. And this is the work that's done by our senior data analyst. Also, what happens here, and Ted mentioned this as well, is this is where we have that capacity to do data linking at the line level of individuals across multiple data sets by using the crosswalk file. And it's the senior data analyst who does that data linking, who puts that project folder together. It's a way of controlling. We never actually, I have a whole separate talk on the how that happens if people are interested on the crosswalk process, but it's what guarantees the security of the data and that ability to link across multiple data sets. And then finally, we have safe outputs. So before data can leave the Institute, we have practices in place, and if they're ready, they think, okay, I'm done, I'm ready to release, they have to put in a vetting request to the senior data analyst. Then the vetting rules are applied on top of that. So what happens is the senior analyst goes through and they're looking for risks of residual disclosure. Maybe we have some really basic rules like no cell size less than 5. So if your population group is very small and for whatever reason there's like 4 people, then that would never get released from the Institute because the risk of re-identification would be so great. And lots of times we have to do a little back and forth on that. And so we're working with the researchers, there's a bit of consultation to find ways to make sure that the data can be released securely. If there's conflict or concerns about the vetting and how the vetting rules are applied, we do have a mechanism in place. We have a committee. So only aggregate results are released. That's also very, very important. And once the researcher, they've got the results, they've been working away, let's say it's a master's student, they've prepared their work, they're ready to share their thesis or go forward, there is still a 30-day embargo. And at this point, we take the requested output back to the data research committee and we say, this is the output, this is what has been produced. And they have an opportunity to review it and to provide feedback on it. They do not have, again, that ability to say, no, you can't release this, but they do have the ability to say, you know, I think you misunderstood what this variable should be used for. I think this wasn't agreed to in the scope of approval, those kind of things. And this has actually proved to be really interesting, some of the feedback that has been provided to the researchers. And I think it makes their work more solid and more robust. And then after that review process, then the publication materials can actually be disseminated. And so through that process, going through those 5 saves, this is how we sort of build that assurance with the government that we are truly protecting their data. So, and then
Donna,
just as a, oh, go ahead, please.
Sorry, Donna, Dave here. A question has just come through on chat. Those safety steps, which are very impressive, is that just for external requests, or is it the government employees have to go through similar processes to analyze the data?
Yes. Anyone who uses the research in our custody goes through those steps.
Okay.
Any requests. So oftentimes what happens with government requests, however, it's led by the researchers in our own institute. And this has been one of the things about having templates and shared. Our data analysts would help complete the data access application form, and it makes that process more seamless, and they're more familiar with the data sets and which variables should be used. So it actually, I make it sound quite cumbersome, but as we do it more and more and more with partners, it seems to be becoming more and more of a seamless process. So people know what to expect now. So does that answer the question?
Yeah.
It's Jody. I'm asking the question more about, so if a team within government has a policy question and they're looking to get some, you know, a pretty quick turnaround for some integrated data, does it still go through this process, or is there another way that everyday questions that come out of doing policy work can be brought to the Institute to have the data linked up?
Mm-hmm. Ted, do you want to field that one?
I can field that. So if a department is interested in, say, can you analyze this for us? And then there is a way that we can receive data through an information manager agreement where it doesn't come onto the platform. So everything that Donna's been reviewing is about data that are in our custody, so we are responsible for them. So if a department said, well, we want you to do quick analysis on this data set that we disclose and we have the authority to disclose to you, then they can do that for that specific purpose. It gets more complicated if the question then arises about, okay, well, we want to see what impact our programming in health has on social development outcomes. Because that then triggers different pieces of the legislation saying, well, if anytime you're matching data, that's another hurdle. So if the data were coming to us within a particular department, that's one thing. But when it comes to multi-departmental data, there's no easy, quick end run around like the barriers that exist between data departments to sharing the data. So they would have to go through this process if it involved match data from multiple departments or agencies.
Yeah, and that's what I understood, Judina, that's what I thought you were asking about, was that interconnection between multiple departments. So hopefully that addresses
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. The last slide that I had was just to mention that there is a process, and this again is an administrative safeguards that are in the legislation around transferring the data. And whether our role, as Ted just mentioned, whether our role is as information manager or as custodian or even as agent, that might be the situation, that we have to have the appropriate agreements in place. And then once we've sort of decided the role and how the data is going to be used, then we can truly identify the data set. And we really need to find out exactly, you have to sort of think of it as an asset that's coming, well, it is an asset that's coming over to our custody. And so we have to be very specific. What is it called? What variables are going to be included? What years of coverage? All of those kind of details around the actual data need to be expressed in the agreements. And then we have this sort of the process where the data is divided from the original custodian, where we will get the program data and we do the data sharing agreement around that, the disclosure schedule, it speaks to the details, and a privacy impact assessment has to be done for any new purpose of personal health information. So a new purpose would be transferring it to the custody of a research data center. So, and again, this is another template we have in place to sort of guide our partners to help them, because when you hear words like impact assessment, you're kind of just like, what? But it's just an impact assessment on what would be the impact of sharing that data set with a secure research environment like ourselves. So we just guide them through that. At the same time, the new unique identifiers for the particular data set in question, that goes to the Department of Health. So a different set of documentation has to be prepared for them so that they can receive that unique identifiers, or receive those unique identifiers and prepare the crosswalk file. So, and then basically around data preparation, it's all that little, the details going through, making sure everything is appropriate for transportation, making sure there's consistency, the data quality, those kind of pieces. Sometimes we get code books, which are phenomenal if we can get those up front, definitions, those kind of things. And only when all the agreements are signed and everything is ready, then we can actually transfer the data or have the data received at the Institute. And even that process is highly secure. It's a drop off, the receipt's given, so we arrange it, password protected. There's all kinds of things that happen around that. So, but I just wanted you to know that there are guiding rules around the transferring process as well. So I guess that's really your sort of privacy 101 when it comes to NB-IRDT. So Ted, I will pass it back to you.
Thanks, Donna. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit just in the interest of time. But before I get into this next section, I just wanted to make one more comment about the question. We did have about a year's worth of discussions with the department, because specifically around the question, like, so if a deputy said, well, I want to be able to have a quick turnaround and I want it to involve multiple departments, what we talked at length about what would that look like? You know, what would we need as a data custodian in terms of permission to grant access that didn't follow our standard kind of process, which is set up for access to linked data. And it was considered by government kind of to be too hard, that with all the processes that we have in place to restrict data access, but facilitate data access, but in this restricted format, it actually gives each disclosing department a lot of reassurance that their data are going to be protected. They know what's going to happen with it, because I think one of the barriers is to interdepartmental sharing is just losing control of it, losing control when you're responsible, when it's your programming. So everyone trusts this process that we have. And that's why I think everyone has been happy to sign on to this, because the model was co-developed. So they all trust the process. So it's not like we're going to a new department going, we have to start from the beginning and explain everything we're going to do to protect the data. They know this and they sign on to it. But that faster sort of expedited review, it was just too hard under the current legislation to do that. So next slide. So I'm going to talk just briefly about our governance and then what we're actually doing with the data. So Our peak governance body is the Partnership Coordination Committee. These are advisory. This is not a board. It's not decision-making, because as a research institute within UNB, it's the Vice President of Research who signs off. I'm not authorized to sign on behalf of the university. They don't trust me to do that. So all of our agreements are within the university. They're signed by the university. So this is an advisory committee. And again, it sort of speaks to the trust that we have built up and the relationships that we built up over the years with the government, because they're entrusting us with their data. We are custodians for it. So it involves the clerk of the Executive Council Office, deputy ministers of the disclosing departments, mainly the health, education, social development, and we've added PEDAL, so there's a fourth as well, and then the health authorities, reflecting the health focus of a lot of what we do. And that committee meets twice a year. We're undergoing a governance review to get something more efficient in terms of governance. But and then Don had already talked about the Data and Research Committee and its importance. And it's made up of the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet, Director of Health Analytics, the government's own Chief Privacy Officer, and representatives from the agencies for which data is thought, and myself and Donna. Next slide. So I guess this kind of sets the, and that's fine, please, yeah, okay. to the next one. This kind of sets the stage for some of the agreements that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So in 2018, there was a memorandum of understanding signed between the clerk and the president of UNB. And it's a memorandum of understanding. So it's not binding, but it commits to kind of the principles of it, that this is a partnership ongoing, that both parties commit to the long-term sustainability of NB-IRDT, commit to an annual research plan, an annual training plan, and designate an NB-IRDT as a researcher of choice for government of New Brunswick, and a reaffirmed participation. So it kind of just set the terms for the relationship going forward. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what are we actually doing with the data. So this, as you can appreciate, there's been a lot of work put into this by our government partners. So what are they getting out of it? And the first research agreement we signed was with Post-Secondary Education Training and Labor PEDAL. So they oversee the higher education sector, a lot of labor market programming, labor market information, apprenticeships, and immigration as well. So they committed to a 5-year deal where they would give us X dollars, and in exchange, we would do a program of research for them. So some of the work will be a little more collaborative, but mainly we are delivering projects of priority identified by the province, by this department. So a lot of it has been interest in, as a small, substantially rural province with an aging population, a lot of it has been around population dynamics. So immigrant attraction, immigrant retention, outcomes, post-secondary graduate retention, and outcomes, labor market information. So immigration in particular, it's interesting that immigration, so through the provincial nominee program, the government runs the provincial nominee program for immigrants under that specific class, but they actually have no way of knowing if it works. They get a count of people whose intended province of residence is New Brunswick, but they don't actually know, or nor can they track who actually moves here and who's still here a year later or 3 years later. So a lot of what we're doing with PEDAL is linking their immigration data or their program, labor market program data, or their education data to our Medicare data. So if you're in New Brunswick, you're going to have an active Medicare registration. And we've been using this as a way to look at population retention and population dynamics. Is we can see where you move within the province, we can see if you leave the province. And so there's been a lot of work done with PEDAL, and it's only been able to be made possible because of the linked data with the Medicare registration data. There's a governance board that sets priorities each year. We monitor progress. They monitor progress quarterly, and at that table sit the deputy and the assistant deputy ministers. So we are ensuring that we are tackling the issues of top priority for them. And in many cases, they don't have research questions. It was a lesson I learned early on when we said, go to the government and say, okay, what are your research questions? They don't have research questions. They have problems, they have challenges, they have issues that the minister is complaining about, and we work with them to craft those into research questions that we can then implement. Next slide. The second set of agreements was with education, early childhood development, and these were specifically around program evaluation. So the first one was an evaluation of a daycare subsidy program. So regulation and structure around daycares being certified as an early learning center, early childhood center, and then also income subsidies to help lower income families afford to be able to afford the childcare costs for their kids to go into school or into daycare. And when in conception, the project was sort of designed for us, because what they really wanted to know was, it's not just, we don't want to know just who's participating in the program. We don't want to know just, then this is typically what happens because of the data limitations. We want to know, is it actually making a difference? Not just in terms of short-term outcomes of the kids. So how are they doing in school? Are they doing better? Did this structured subsidized daycare access improve learning outcomes once they get into school? Did it improve their graduation? Did it improve their attendance? But also beyond education, did it improve their health outcomes? Did it improve like what are the other social impacts? But also not just for the kids, but for the parents. With kids in daycare, that means parents are able to say, go back to school, or to get labor market training, or to join the workforce. And then the focus on medium and longer term outcomes. And the second one was sort of similar in conception. The Department of Education, working with the teachers union, said that they wanted to put in place this sort of research question. They said, we're going to add an extra hour of instruction to kindergarten to grade 2. So 1 hour a day on Wednesdays. And we want to see what effect this has on the kids' outcomes, effects on children, parents, teachers, school support staff in the short, and the medium, and longer term. So there's a qualitative component to that, but there's also a data component to that. And so because of these agreements, within a relatively short amount of time, the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development has sent us a lot, like pretty much everything of research relevance to us. We've been besieged by EECD data. And again, both these projects are around, they're not possible without the access to the linked data that we have. And so each of these comes with significant funding that supports those programs. Next slide. I'm just going to focus quickly on a priority project on student retention. So this is one we've just been working on, and it's interesting in it's a simple question. How is New Brunswick doing at keeping its post-secondary graduates? Are they staying in New Brunswick once they graduate? Doesn't matter if they're from New Brunswick or they're from Ontario or from Nova Scotia. Are they staying here? Doesn't matter. Does it vary by field of study? Does it, like if you're studying nursing, we know that we have a nursing crisis in terms of supply of nurses in New Brunswick. So how are we doing in retaining those students? So we take K-12 school data so that to identify New Brunswick students. We link to post-secondary enrollment and graduation data for our 4 public universities and 3 community college systems. And we link to Medicare registration data. So, and then we look at how those retention rates vary by home province or country, field of study, location of study, personal characteristics. And then we benchmark against NPHEC survey results. So what they do is they contact people who graduate, they ask them to return a survey, there's survey issues to do with that. This is administrative data. We're looking at these retention rates. And so this was a major project. There are going to be multiple, we completed the first phase, there are going to be multiple phases to it, and it touches multiple departments. And so, and the other thing that with administrative data, that we can get those answers out in terms of the timeliness of the data. So the data we have on Medicare is coming from, I think it's up to early 2020. So you can go through the Statistics Canada RDC, you can get income tax data linked to PCIS data, but that's about 4 years old. We are doing that as well as a supplement to this work, but we can get really timely information on graduates from 2018. Now, are they still in the province? Next slide. And maybe of interest to our Atlantic Canadian partners that we signed a research agreement with the Council of Atlantic Ministers of Education and Training, or CAMET, to support each of the Atlantic provinces in preparing and transferring their K-12 school data to Statistics Canada for linkage. So this project on post-secondary education outcomes for residents of Atlantic Canada is going to involve K-12 school data, post-secondary enrollment data, and tax filer data via the Statistics Canada Research Data Center. And so all of those files will be linked. They'll come back down to the StatCan RDC. There's one in Halifax. There's one in Memorial. There's one in St. John, Moncton, and Fredericton. I'm the academic director for them. Not the Halifax one, but the other ones. And we want to study questions like the choice to enter post-secondary education. So what makes a school leaver go into higher education? Is it or community college or university? The mobility following graduation, and the earnings and labor market outcomes and experiences with unemployment following graduation. So that's funded by ChemEd. And so we will be working with each of the Atlantic Departments of Education on a data transfer process to connect with Statistics Canada. Just as an aside, we can't do this in-house in IRDT ourselves because we can't get income tax information. No provincial data center is allowed to get income tax information until there's a change to federal legislation on the Income Tax Act. And then so we will, once the data sets are prepared and transferred, we will do the analysis for each of the 4 provinces. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap up. You can skip that one. We have lots of projects underway, and you can skip that one as well. If you're interested, you have a copy of the slides. So enablers to success. So features of the New Brunswick approach. 1, we are data custodian with a clearly defined research mandate. So when Donna mentioned that researchers only get the minimum data departments are disclosing the full data set to us. So we have custody of the full data sets, and we ensure minimum disclosure of data. And this is another element of the trust that they have in this, and the trust and the co-development in all the processes that Donna revealed, that they trust us because they were part of the development of all those processes and policies from the beginning. The central role played by the Executive Council Office was fundamental. The corporate role played by the GMB Department of Health for data matching. And as Donna mentioned, there's no UMB affiliation required to access the data. This was a provincial resource. It happened to be housed at UMB, but this is available to all residents of the province as long as they follow the rules. And it's also politically neutral. We do not do policy pieces and advocate for or against particular policy decisions. We focus on the research and the evaluation. There are conclusions that come from it, but we don't do like policy commentary, because we have to remain politically neutral. I think the next slide is my last slide. Why has it worked? Well, from the beginning, there were enough champions in the provincial government across multiple departments who believed in the vision and commitment to supporting evidence-based policy and program development. We had a clearly defined mandate to meet a demand that was not currently available in the department, either because of a lack of resources or a lack of capacity or a lack of legislative barriers to data sharing. That it was fundamental that we be seen not to be a challenge to the department's own operations, that this be complementary and we avoid duplication. So we are adding capacity, we are undertaking work that the province cannot do on its own. We had champions that were vital for us to get to where we are. And then state infrastructure, we were very fortunate to be part of MSSU New Brunswick, which provided us funding. So in the first 5 years, when we talked to these different departments, I would actually say, we don't want your money. We want to work with you to support your programming through data development. And then this long-term relationship built on mutual trust. Every department we're working with trusts us. They trust us more than they trust each other sometimes, because everything that we're doing is so prescribed and clearly laid out, and they were part of that from the beginning. So that's how we built this model, based on trust and mutual development from the beginning. If we just went this entire way with health, and then we try and retrofit other departments, there's always going to be, wait a second, what are you doing with my data? How is this working? I wasn't part of this. But because it was co-developed from the beginning, now we're at a point with the data holdings that departments are coming to us saying, can you do this for us? Because we can't do it ourselves. And this is where we wanted to be. I think that's my last slide, Don, except for our contact information. Oh, more to know. We can skip that because we're close to time. And there's our contact information. So back to you, David.
Well, thank you both.